What that means is that we are in the process of figuring out how to rebuild our union. What we need today is either a union or a different kind of organization that sets its goal, the struggle and fight to shape government itself. The demands and our needs cannot be gotten out of the employer-employee relationship. We have never been at this point before in America. And I think that as we learn how to fight the struggle around shaping government to be responsible to citizens, as we engage this new struggle, we're going to figure out how to wage it. But it's a new point, in my opinion, that we reached in our history. On that note, let me pass it.
Madam Secretary. Thank you, Wasteland, for sharing your thoughts. I first wanted to send regrets from Kevin Thies, who ran for Senate back in 2006 on the Green Party platform and hoped to be here tonight with us. He had to leave the social forum early on Thursday to get back home for something going on there, but he sent his regrets and did want me to tell you that he wishes he could be here with you tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit because, is this? That other microphone is pointing your way. Okay, I think that's on. Are we good? Yeah. I think this was on too. Is that okay? Or are you still on? Oh, I'm sorry. Is that for your camera? Okay, sorry. I'm a pediatrician. I left practice about 3 years ago to work on health reform full-time because in my 15 years of practice, I was being pushed more and more into situations where I felt like I could not provide quality care and practice what I had trained to do. So I had the pleasure, I guess you could call it the pleasure, over the last year of serving as the Congressional Fellow for Physicians for National Health Program. And so was up close and personal in this health reform process that we just went through. And I wanted to share a little bit about that with you because we've come into another situation here in this country where we're seeing a very similar process play out that played out last year. So the decisions about what kind of reform was going to be passed were made back in the summer of 2008. Those decisions and deals were already cut because there was a lot of fear about what had happened in the 90s, and nobody wanted to have a repeat of what happened in the 90s. Unfortunately, they learned the wrong lessons from that. Instead of the lesson that they took was that if you can't fight your enemies, you just bring them to the table and find out what they'll let you do, I guess, and then you do that. So they created this very scripted process. It was very tightly controlled. It started with, in December of 2008, they had the house parties. Did you guys have those here? That the Team for Obama had, you got your script and you got your neighbors together and you went through this script and you were supposed to fill out the little comments. And I attended a number of those house parties and was struck by the limitation and narrowing of how it was leading everybody down a certain path. We know for a fact that a lot of those house parties, people said that they wanted single-payer systems. In the ultimate report, which was a few hundred pages long, we got a paragraph on single-payer. And then we saw that play out again. I was working with a coalition of organizations in Washington known as the Leadership Conference for Guaranteed Health Care. Now, in terms of our membership, which included the National Nurses Union, Physicians for National Health Program, Healthcare Now, a number of faith-based and labor organizations, we represented about 20 million people nationwide. So we had teams in Washington, and we were meeting with leadership in Congress and saying, as this process moves forward, will you allow our voice to be at the table? And as we got closer and closer to the actual hearings, the committee hearings, we were told no, that we would not have a seat at the table. And when we looked at who did have a seat at the table, it was the CEOs of health insurance companies, it was the health insurance lobbyists, the pharmaceutical lobbyists, the big business. They were all invited to the table, but we were not allowed to bring our health policy experts and advocates to the table. And so as many of you know, when the health reform process hit the Senate Finance Committee chaired by Max Baucus, and we were not allowed to be there. With the 41 people who were allowed to be there, we did go down there, 8 of us, and stand up in the committee and expose the fact that we were being excluded, and were arrested for that. So, and the rest, and so we did have some wins as a result of that, actually. They had really tried to exclude our voice, and one thing that did come out of last year is that we fought in every way that we could to have our voice injected, and so we did end up being, after that, the next Senate committee invited me to testify. I was the first person to testify in that committee. Then we had people testify in the House. We had amendments, single-payer amendments. There was one amendment that made it to the floor in the Senate in December that would have replaced the Senate bill with a single-payer bill. That was introduced by Senators Sanders, Burris, and Sherrod Brown. That's the first time that single-payer anything legislation has made it to the floor in either house, in either body of our government, ever in the history of this nation. I'm sure you probably didn't hear much about it because it couldn't make the news, but that was actually killed by a physician, senator from Oklahoma, Senator Colburn. But we did make some progress. We did force the leadership to say repeatedly that we were not doing single-payer. That was a plus for us. We did force the president to admit many times that single-payer was a better solution, but we weren't going to do that. So we pushed and we made some progress. And there were 3 basic concepts that I took away from, 3 things that I learned from this process over the last year. And there was a nurse who reminded me that actually they stand for, the initials of them are ICU. And many of you know ICU stands for Intensive Care Unit. So our country's in a pretty serious situation when it comes to health care, and we need the ICU. And the I stands for independence. What we learned is that we have to build an independent movement that is solid, that is willing to hold legislators accountable. We saw so many so-called progressive groups over the last year who were basically compromising their principles more and more in order to serve the re-election of our president. And so the next one, the C, is actually clarity. We have to be really clear about what we're standing for, because we heard so many people saying that this legislation is universal, that it's affordable, that it's guaranteed, and it is none of those things. But people hear those words and they buy them and they think that's what they're getting. We've got to know what they are considering, what it means for us. So we've got to educate ourselves and understand, and that means clarity of what we're asking for. And the third piece is U, and it stands for uncompromising. We saw so much get compromised away in this reform process. How quickly our government was willing to jettison immigrants, both legal, both documented and undocumented. How quickly they were willing to jettison women's reproductive rights. How willing they were to accept the fact that we would leave tens of millions of people uninsured. We, in this nation, when you look at other industrialized nations and the social infrastructure that they have, we've accepted crumbs for too long in this country because we're willing to compromise, and that's only led us down a dangerous path. And so we must be uncompromising in what we ask for and be solid in what our fundamental request is. And we know for a fact that the only way we're going to get a health care system that's universal and affordable is if we go to a single-payer public financing system. Nothing short of that is going to become a single-payer system or become a system, because we really have a choice between, are we going to accept a market-based model of financing health care, or are we going to accept a human rights, public goods model of financing health care? And the market model will always be seeing health care as a commodity, and always mean that there will be people that will be left out, and that people will only be able to afford the health care, get the health care that they can afford. And that's been shown over and over again. So the smallest step that we can take is to create a single public fund. And from there, we have a lot of work to do. We need to increase the number of caregivers that we have. We need to make sure that there are